Mr. Speaker, thanks very much. I'm rising, of course, to support this Revenue Fines and Other Legislation Amendment Bill 2023. As was indicated by the Minister and the Opposition in reply, this is the sort of bill which is, I suppose, the routine of government in a lot of ways. It's one of those bills that covers a range of areas to try and ensure that we are continuing to fix any holes that appear in our ability to raise revenue for the people of New South Wales, and to ensure that we're responding to emerging circumstances that may come up as we are going through that constant process. And I suppose it's one of the things about tax law and revenue and so on in Australia and in any country that it's a constant process of revising to ensure that you are collecting the revenue you're supposed to collect, that you're closing any loopholes that may arise that enable people to avoid their legitimate taxation responsibilities. And that's vitally important for the people of New South Wales because, of course, that revenue is what makes it possible for us to actually fund our hospitals and our schools and the other vital services excuse me, that the people of New South Wales want. And as a state government, of course, our sources of revenue are quite limited. We've got, of course, the major components of our revenue coming from the federal government through the GST and through grants, but as a state government, our sources of own source revenue are fairly limited. Things like stamp duties, payroll taxes, land taxes, taxes on motor vehicle ownership and operation, and gambling and betting taxes. And I think if you were to sit down and have a sensible look at our tax system overall, you could probably fairly cogently argue that there's a number of those taxes that state governments rely on that you'd probably rather you weren't having to collect at all because of the negative impacts that they might have or the negative implications of people spending the money in those areas. So it's always a challenging task for state governments when they do look at their revenue base and how they're going to manage it and how they're going to keep up with the increasing demands of, for instance, a health system which grows, continues to project to be growing to becoming the biggest item of our expenditure by a very, very long way over a period of time. And I think, as a nation, all governments spend more than $150 billion a year on health. So those sort of growth in expenditure requirements mean that we have to continually look at how we are raising taxes in New South Wales, how we ensure that people who are meant to pay a particular tax are actually doing that, and how we ensure that that is as fair and as equitable as possible. So a lot of these items in this bill, which may seem to be, relatively minor, are part of that process, and some of them are not so minor. So there's a number of amendments in the bill to legislation to ensure that we are keeping up with the people who may not wish to pay as much tax, and in particular, you look at things like enhancing recovery of tax debts from Phoenix operators for payroll tax. And as the opposition spokesperson just said, we know what Phoenix companies are, and often they're used by people to separate themselves from a previous liability that they may have had as a taxpayer. So in this case, we're amending the legislation to ensure that if there is payroll tax coming from groups of companies which may include a Phoenix-style company, that's included. And that's important to ensure that we aren't seeing that sort of dodging of tax liabilities. The very strange comment from the opposition spokesperson there that suggesting that the amendments in this bill to create a new offence with substantial penalties for a person who uses or discloses confidential tax-related information provided by Revenue New South Wales or conceals such behaviour would be liable for up to more than $1 million in fines for an individual, or up to $5.5 million for a corporation or a partnership, and that is quite correctly known as the PwC amendments in I suppose, common terms. I'm a bit surprised to hear the opposition suggesting that the government is virtue signalling in putting that in place. And think inevitably if we'd come in here and were not acting to ensure that those sort of offences were created, that we would have been accused of being blind to the possibility of those similar things happen in the state level that happened at the federal level. So I think that is an absolutely sensible amendment that's being made to this. And the PwC thing issue has certainly shocked a lot of people. It's certainly dented confidence in a number of those external advisory firms. And while the opposition might talk about us not using organisations like PwC to provide advice on the drafting of bills, we know that they certainly weren't shy to spend a hell of a lot of government funds over their last period in government on getting external advice on different things, on getting consultants. In fact, we heard in question time today the exorbitant bills that they racked up on consultants. So I think it is entirely relevant that we would be following up from the great work that's been done to reveal this scandal at PwC, and I'd really like to credit Senator Deb O'Neill and other Labor members of the Senate in revealing all of this information to make sure that we are able to avoid that sort of circumstance. And it's good government that says, all right, we haven't seen that happen now, but doesn't then sit back and say, oh, gee, the opposition might accuse us of virtue signalling if we do something about this. It's a good government that says, let's avoid that happening to us in the future. And I think that's a very a good initiative that we saw from the Finance Minister, and we've seen follow through in this legislation that we're discussing today. So it is important to be doing that as we move through this legislation. I have to say, maybe with my 0 demerit points at the moment on my driver's licence, I might be bragging. I have had them in the past, but not at the moment. I have to say, it was only recently that I heard about the practice of people offering to effectively sell their demerit points for people. And I've heard reports of people being paid up to $5,000 for 3 demerit points. So in other words, they write the declaration that says they were driving the vehicle at the time that the demerit points were accrued, and they take them. And as you know, it's only I suppose word of mouth or gossip, but I have heard of prices of up to $5,000 for those 3 demerit points. So that's pretty appalling. I have to say I was a bit shocked by that, because I'd never even crossed my mind that people would be doing that. But I think it's absolutely appropriate that this legislation goes through and does create the new offence of offering to be falsely nominated as the driver at the time of an offence and providing false or misleading information. Because by definition, what that is potentially doing is allowing a driver who is driving in an unsafe manner to actually continue to do that. Now, look, I know some people out there view speeding and so on as a bit of a competition. Oh, terribly unfair they got caught. Well, bad luck, it's not, because if you have a problem with a speed limit, go and ask for the speed limit to be changed, but don't break the law. And that's something which I think is important for us to take a strong stance on, and we are in this, because it is totally inappropriate for people to be able to undertake that trading off or buying off of their demerit points in that sort of circumstance. So I'd certainly strongly endorse that aspect of this legislation. As we know, there's a number of initiatives in this legislation to clarify various duties on changing superannuation funds, again to make sure that the proper value is actually recorded, to provide exemptions on certain native title related transfers, and to modernise some of the processes of reporting and collection. It enables some consistency in some of the grace payments and so on under the Acts. And also amends the State Debt Recovery Act 2018 to create a new offence of providing false or misleading information. And Madam Deputy Speaker, can I seek an extension?
The member seeks an extension. Is that granted?
Yes.
Member.
Thanks, Madam Deputy Speaker. So, as I said at the outset, it's quite important that we continue to have this focus on how we collect our revenue in New South Wales, how we maximise the revenue, because it is so important to us being able to provide those government services that are vitally important to the people of New South Wales. Now, I guess one of my concerns about that, as I just mentioned before, is the narrowness of the revenue sources that we have at state level, and it does come down to how we can manage budgets. And we've certainly seen over the last few weeks the history of the previous government in their budget management, and the fact that we saw such amazing pre-election spending money which we had not collected through the revenues available to the state, and leaving our state now with a $187 billion debt and a massive prospective deficit in years ahead. And if we can go through and we can do all these sensible bills, but if you then have a government in place, as the previous government was, which goes out there and performs these sleight of hand tricks on its own expenditure, where they seek to mislead the people of New South Wales by announcing programs and suggesting to the people of New South Wales they'll continue, but not including them in the forward estimates, not even putting them up to the Parliamentary Budget Office for costings before election, and thus giving the people of New South Wales a false impression of the prospective deficit, then it's very hard to see how you can manage properly. And I'm very pleased to be a part of a government which has tackled in a very open way some of those challenges of budget management in New South Wales, and is being open with the people of New South Wales about the challenges, about the fact that we do face some real challenges in bringing the budget deficit left to us by the previous government back into a position where we can sustainably deliver the services that the people of New South Wales need. Really, when you do see that consistency of information that came from the previous government, the pork barrelling that went on, the political decision making that went on about the expenditure of government funds, it is something that should worry, I think, the taxpayers and voters of New South Wales as they head up to the next election in 3.5 years' time, as to whether or not the previous government could ever again be trusted with the books. Now, we will, as we go through this term of government, see a number of things which are about trying to make sure that we are being responsible budget managers. And we're going to see the budget, of course, in the next 2-week session of this Parliament. And that'll set the scene for us over the next 4 years. And I'm confident that in doing that, we'll see a government which has been required, unfortunately, to make some tough decisions, but will be doing that so that it can actually focus on the priorities that the people of New South Wales told us were their priorities. Things like making sure that we are retaining those essential service workers in the positions that we need them in, and ensuring that we can provide the services and not just the big cheque handovers at various times around New South Wales. And I'm confident that we'll see that over the next few weeks. This legislation is just a small part of that responsible budget management that we are undertaking in New South Wales. And I'd have to say, from my personal point of view, I would be quite happy to see a much wider discussion of revenue collection in Australia. We saw many years ago the Henry Tax Review. These things so often just get waylaid by negative publicity at the start, and that leaves us as state governments, and of whatever persuasion happens to be in state governments, with quite narrow revenue sources to try and fund the essential services that we all rely on. And that's something which I think is going to be a challenge to this government and any future government as we go through. But Madam Deputy Speaker, I commend this legislation to the House.
And of course,